So hi, my name is Anne Marie Cox. I'm a youth counselor and a prevention specialist with the Town of Granby Youth Service Bureau. One of our primary objectives is to be a lead prevention educator within our community. In years past, one of the ways we did that is we would hold a series of evening presentations for parents where we would invite them in and we would have roundtables or focus group discussions where we would go over the topics of prevention that we felt were the most important to parents at a particular time. Over the last several years, we've seen the number of parents who've been able to attend these meetings decline significantly, even though interest in the topics has remained high. So, in order to get our message out and give parents the information that they need to raise children and keep them as safe as possible, in conjunction with GCTV, we are dragging the Youth Service Bureau kicking and screaming into the 21st century. We are now going to be able to provide you with access to the information that we have learned about that we think is going to be appropriate and meaningful for our community in a format that you'll be able to access at your convenience. Rather than coming to a community space at a designated time, you'll be able to stream this, watch it in the convenience of your own home, or if you're tech savvy, maybe even at lunch or on your phone while you're waiting to pick up your kids at school. So we hope that this will give you the access to the information you need in a way that is easy and convenient. The first topic that we're going to do in our series is going to cover the development of the adolescent brain. We felt this was a really good place to start because understanding what's happening in a teenage brain is really going to help us understand all the other topics that we'll cover throughout this series. So our first slide. Ask most parents of a teenager and they'll let you know that adolescence is nuts. Kids are impulsive. They make poor choices. They're moody. They take crazy risks. It's been the same for thousands of years. What's different today is that we finally understand why the teenage years are so mixed up, and the answers also explain the increased risks of addiction underage use incurs. Our next slide shows thus that adolescents are not little adults. Adolescents, and we can't treat them that way. From a clinical standpoint, they respond differently to treatment than adults do, and from a parenting standpoint, well, the next slide says it all. Your nice, sweet 10-year-old is now a walking, talking bundle of emotions, impulses, eye rolls, and hunger. Our next slide shows us that new scientific discoveries are altering our perspective on how to understand adolescent behavior. Now, research into the adolescent brain suggests that the human brain is still maturing through the adolescent years, with changes continuing on into the early 20s. The developing brain of the teenage years can provide clues as to why adolescents may be more prone to taking risks and why teenagers are particularly vulnerable to the effects of drugs. These new scientific discoveries provide valuable lessons for parents and for adults that work with youth. They reinforce the importance that teenagers benefit from guidance provided by adults and that careful and regular monitoring of their behavior is a high priority for parents. Additionally, we're learning more all the time about both the benefits and dangers presented by youth exposure to electronics, the internet, and social media. An understanding of how the brain develops can help parents understand why certain behaviors are so problematic for youth. The science of addiction to drugs, alcohol, social media, and pornography are tied in to what's happening in the brain as it develops. This next slide shows that we used to think about that the brain was mature at the point that the brain was adult size, which would have happened around age 10. But now we know that brain maturation has nothing to do with brain size. The next slide shows what led to this emerging understanding of brain development. During the 1990s, there was a rapid growth in brain imaging technologies. These advances have provided windows on the developing brain that we didn't have before. To be blunt, prior to these technologies, scientists were simply able to compare the volume and weight of brains from cadavers. But today, scientists are using these new technologies to better understand the process of brain construction during adolescence by looking at living pictures of the developing brain. This next slide shows us an immature brain. At birth, there are not a lot of neurons or synapses formed yet. The brain is a blank slate. From birth to age 5, there is an explosion of the connections made. Think about what a baby learns. Recognizing faces and expressions, cause and effect, the beginnings of trust and bonding, motor development and language. So very much happens in these early years. One of our later parent prevention topics will focus on issues parents need to continue about allowing infants and young children exposure to electronic equipment and entertainment. It's an emerging area of study, and it's going to be a challenge for parents to figure out how to maintain an appropriate balance for these tiny learners. Today, however, we're simply going to develop a basic understanding of what's happening and why adolescents are at a higher risk of addiction later in life when exposed to certain things during adolescence because of how their brain is developing. Our next slide talks about blossoming. During the blossoming period, between birth to age 5 or 6, there is a ton of brain activity. All of these connections are formed as that child learns new things. Then our next slide introduces the concept of pruning. The brain is wired to be open to new learning and structuring during these early years. Think of learning a new language. It's so much easier at 5 than at 11. Why? Well, science has found that after the first blossoming of connections, the brain begins a pruning process. During pruning, those neuronal connections that are not used are going to get pruned away. Stop learning those new languages, well then the pathways that made it easy to do are cut. Our next slide shows us that the connections that are still active in use are kept. These connections go through a rewiring process called myelination. I personally think of it like taking the wiring in an old house and replacing those old wires with new, faster ones. Myelination is a process in which a myelin sheath forms around the pathways which allow them to work more efficiently, like a better insulated wire in that old house. Our next slide shows us that when that pruning and myelination process is complete, the brain can work faster and will be more efficient. But during the pruning process, the brain is not functioning at optimal capacity. Because the pruning process occurs in stages across different brain structures, it's informative for us to examine this process in more detail. Our next slide looks at the way our brain matures. It develops from the back to the front. Pink is gray matter. That's where the brain synapses are. The blue is white matter, and that's where the axons connect the gray matter to other areas of gray matter in the brain. As the pruning process takes place, we lose gray matter and develop more white matter as the brain shifts from forming those synapses to actually making the connection and communication between the existing ones faster and more efficient. The other thing to notice is that the whole brain doesn't change at once. These scans show how different parts of the brain develop at different times. This is key to understanding the impact as the brain development has on adolescents. The brain develops from the back to the front. So, on the next slide, let's look at what controls what. The prefrontal cortex controls judgment. The cerebellum plays an important role in coordination. The hippocampus is important in learning and memory. And the brain's reward circuit, which consists of the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area. This reward circuit functions to promote pleasure, such as the pleasure derived from eating and from sex. However, in people with addiction, the brain reward circuit is overtaken by the impact of those substances, including alcohol, marijuana, and opioids. Remember, brain development starts at the back and moves towards the front. So the cerebellum, which controls coordination, develops long before the frontal cortex that controls judgment. The back parts of the brain, which develop earlier, include the cerebellum and the occipital lobes and are important for the physical coordination and balance and our ability to visually access our surroundings. So toddler milestones are balance, walking, and coordination. Then we have our preschool milestones. And then our school-age milestones of achievement. And finally, our adolescent milestones, impulse control. The prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the frontal lobe that matures last and helps us with planning and organization and impulse control, doesn't finish developing until around age 25. Our next slide looks at these implications of this restructuring. Thinking about this, it explains some things. Now we know why teenagers prefer sensation-seeking and physical activities over ones that require a great deal of complex thinking. We know why they show less than optimal planning and judgment. We know why they engage in more risk-taking and impulsive behaviors compared to when the person is older. And we know they're less likely to be inclined to consider the possible negative consequences of risky behaviors. As a mom, like so many others, am very familiar with looking into my teenager's eyes and asking, what were you thinking? And that deer in the headlight look I got meant that they weren't thinking. The frontal cortex was hijacked by the more efficient, already rewired impulsive centers of the brain and the reward-seeking parts of the brain that made things like trying to slide down that rail on a skateboard, seeking glory and props from peers, seem like a good idea. A broken arm never once entered into the thought process. So let's look more closely at what's happening during that rewiring process during those teen years. Again, going back the next slide to what controls what. Look at that purple part of the brain in the slide. This is a key component. The purple part is the reward center of the brain. For most of human development, the things that triggered that reward center for a typical adolescent were food and sex. A key developmental milestone of a teenager is going through puberty and becoming capable of procreation. This is a key factor in the survival of the species. As puberty takes place, youth become aware of the beginnings of sexual attraction. The sight of a pretty boy or girl begins to elicit a release of dopamine that stimulates the reward center. Teens are also very food-driven, and eating is also responsible for these dopamine releases. What part of the brain is rewiring smack dab in the middle of adolescence when our kids are in middle school and high school? The area of the brain with that reward center. So if we take the natural highs of the beginnings of sexual attraction or a really good pizza, and we add the highs, measured by the amount of dopamine release, of alcohol, marijuana, or prescription pills, there is no comparison. The artificial high is much greater. What researchers are finding is that exposure to certain things that create an artificial high during adolescence actually wire the brain to seek these higher level of dopamine release. This is why teens exposed to drugs and other addictive things during this critical period are 6 times more likely to develop an addiction later in life than teens who do not drink or use drugs until after age 21. Why is 21 a magic number? Again, look at the brain development. By 21, almost all adolescents have finished rewiring the part of the brain with the reward center in it. If I could have $1 for every time somebody said, "But I drank as a teen and I'm okay." When people tell me this, I respond with one question. Do you know somebody with a problem with alcohol or drugs? Everybody does. The answer to you not having a problem is that you got lucky. Do you want your child to rely on luck to avoid an addiction later in life? If not, then as parents, we have to stop the mindset that says, hey, I drank as a kid, all teens do it, it's okay. Okay, so what do we do with this information? The research is really clear. The single most powerful prevention tool is parents who set expectations about accessing drugs or other addicting materials, enforce boundaries, and reinforce those boundaries on an ongoing basis. There is an amazing study by Dr. Robert Tarasi from Pennsylvania State University, which looked at a large sampling of entering freshmen. Thousands were in this study. His control group entered college as usual. The test group had parents that were given a handbook that he developed that simply outlined how to talk to their entering freshmen about the risks of underage drinking and how for them to express their desire to their child that they did not want their child to drink. Parents followed the handbook and conversed with their freshmen throughout the year on those expectations and concerns. The results were significant. Those in the test group had significantly more students who did not drink at all, and that those who did drink far less when compared to the control group. The study also looked at parenting styles and effectiveness. They grouped parental communication entering the study as either highly effective, moderately effective, or ineffective. What is profound is that even the families with ineffective communication patterns prior to using the handbook had as a whole freshmen who drank less than children from highly effective parents and families who did not use the handbook. The implication? Even if you have great parenting skills, open, understanding, and free communication, if you do not focus on repeatedly communicating expectations and boundaries, you lose power over the decisions your teen makes. So start the conversation early and keep it going throughout adolescence. Children whose parents have these boundaries and conversations have children who experiment less, start or delay their start until later, and if they do drink, they tend to drink less than children whose parents do not talk to them about it on a regular basis. Again, just a reminder that while this adolescent brain is developing and under construction, remember, it is more reward-focused than at any other stage of development. The reward center is being restructured and rewired, and if we add drugs, it changes what the brain is wired to seek as a reward. Without drugs, sex and food are the primary drives. Drugs can overwrite this. Alcohol is still the most commonly abused drug in the lives of Granby teens, closely followed by marijuana. So today we're going to take a real quick look at how alcohol impacts the developing brain and how the developing brain impacts the way teens use alcohol. We're now going to dive into the impact of alcohol on our teens. Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. It acts at many sites, including the spinal cord, the cerebellum, and the cerebral cortex, and on many neurotransmitter systems. Alcohol is a very small molecule, and it's soluble in both lipid and water solutions. Because of these properties, alcohol gets into the bloodstream very easily and also crosses the blood-brain barrier. One of the neurochemical effects of alcohol is it increases the turnover of norepinephrine and dopamine. Remember, dopamine is what triggers that reward center. So when we look at this next slide that compares the age of first use, the scale is really clear. The younger a child is at the age of first use, the greater the risk of developing an addiction later in life. Now you have an understanding of why that is, because the reward center is being rewired. So if a child starts drinking at 13, they are drinking the entire time. That reward center is being rewired. The later a child waits, the more likely that reward center is to have been wired to look for a more natural high. In addition to understanding the way adolescent brain impacts the chances of developing an addiction when exposed to alcohol, it's also important to understand that adolescents process and consume alcohol differently than adults do. Because we know it's dangerous for teens to drink, it's unethical to run studies where teens are asked to drink. Thus, many of the studies that we cite tend to look at alcohol effects on adolescents, don't use humans, they use, you guessed it, rats. Our next slide takes us to the water maze test. Welcome to the water maze test, where it involved rats being put into a pool of water with a platform that was hidden under the water. They had to swim around and find that platform so that they could stand on it and not have to keep swimming. In the study of alcohol, researchers had a group of adolescent rats and a group of adult rats. They gave half of each group alcohol and the other half a saline solution. Then they put each rat into the water maze and measured things like how fast they swam and how long it took them to find the hidden platform. Then they compared the swim speed and maze completion times between the 4 groups of rats. What were those 4 groups? We had sober adult rats and drunk adult rats, sober adolescent rats and drunk adolescent rats. Let's see how they did on the next slide. When they looked at the adult rats, what they found was that drunk adult rats swam slower and took more time to get to the platform than sober adult rats. This is pretty easily correlated to our own understanding of drunk human adults. Think of that drunk guy at the mud or obstacle course. He's usually beaten by the sober guy in his age group. Our next slide looked at the adolescent groups. And what they found, surprisingly, was that the drunk adolescent rats did not slow down, and they actually got to the platform faster than their sober peers. This also matches observations of humans. So alcohol does not slow teens down the way it does adults. How many of you remember what it was like when you were in your early 20s? You could probably party all night long, feel okay, still get up the next morning and go to work. But somewhere in your later 20s, it began to hit you. You went out, you drank, you got tired. You started going home earlier, and you started feeling crappy the next day. The difference in how alcohol impacts teens is important when we look at how it affects the way they drink. Our next slide looks at the leading causes of mortality in age groups 10 to 14 in the United States, and this is from survey data from 2013. If we look at the causes of death in kids in the first 4 groups, all of these groups are associated with alcohol consumption. So the children killed in motor vehicle crashes, unintentional injuries, homicides, and suicides are all increasingly or have an increased likelihood of involving alcohol. What percentage of alcohol consumed by underage drinkers occurs in the context of a binge? That 90% isn't a typo. 90% of all alcohol consumed by teenagers is done so in a binge drinking episode. And that is on average for boys more than 5 drinks in a half an hour period of time and 3 to 4 drinks amongst females. When teens binge, they consume more alcohol fast, and they don't have the depressant effect that adults will experience. So they can consume more alcohol before passing out. So this encourages the binge drinking, and this can also lead to alcohol poisoning and death. I have some other videos taken on college campuses, and it shows young men particularly drinking like 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 shots in a relatively short period of time. Most adults could not consume that alcohol without passing out or throwing up. Unfortunately, the way the teens metabolize it, they can. So they can get very, very drunk and get approaching that point of alcohol toxicity without knowing how dangerous their circumstances are. So in addition to the risks of addiction, how they drink is also a risk to them as well. Now let's look at some of the other risks unique to teens when they consume alcohol. Our next slide shows us one part of the brain that has been found in research studies to be especially sensitive to the effects of alcohol, and that's the hippocampus. That's outlined here in blue. It's in the temporal lobe. This is the part of the brain that plays a major role in learning and forming memories. It also helps to regulate sleep. The hippocampus typically grows during childhood and adolescence. Our next slide shows, again, studies with rodents, and these studies have suggested that the hippocampus is particularly sensitive to alcohol, especially during adolescence. Dr. Bells and colleagues were looking at the size, and they found that hippocampus size in rats who had been consuming, adolescent rats who had consumed alcohol, were significantly smaller than the size in the healthy control teams. Our next slide furthers that study. These are examples of 2 teenagers from the study. On the right is a non-drinking 16-year-old female, and on the left, an alcoholic 16-year-old female. The brain images are a top view looking down just above ear level. The warm colors show parts of the brain where there's a lot of activity for a memory task that was given during the scanning session. And the cool colors show part of the brain that were less active than the baseline during this task. So, both teens have a similar pattern of brain response, but it's clear that the alcohol-dependent girl has much more activation. Both alcohol-dependent and non-drinking teens perform similarly. They were able to do the memory test. What this seems to indicate is that in early stages of drinking, teens maybe need to use more of their brain resources, or in effect work harder to maintain performance, and they're able to do that. Keep in mind that these teens have only been drinking for about 2 years, and while they show signs of altered brain activation, the performance isn't yet suffering in the alcohol-impaired teenager. Our next slide takes us to adults at age 20. These pictures are of adult women. The picture on the right is a 20-year-old woman who was given the same task. She'd been drinking heavily for 5 years and is now at 10% impairment on the task. Compared to her age mate, who was not alcohol involved, she showed substantially less activation in the brain. We put these 2 studies together. It's possible to come to a conclusion that the brain may compensate by working harder and use different brain areas in the beginnings of alcohol dependency. But if the neurotoxic insult continues, the brain no longer is able to compensate as effectively, and that is when we start to see a diminishing performance in tasks relying on memory. Again, as we look at that reduced size of the hippocampus. What are the conclusions that we can draw from this? The brain development places adolescents at exposed risk to addicting material. And if they're exposed during adolescence, they have a significantly greater risk of a lifelong addiction. Alcohol is not only addictive, but is processed differently by the adolescent brain, leading to increased binge drinking. Alcohol consumption impacts the hippocampus and memory systems development. At first, adolescents might be able to compensate for the hippocampus deficits by working harder, but eventually they no longer can, and this is going to lead to poorer performance on memory tasks that may be lifelong. Thank you and stay tuned. I really appreciate you taking the time to go through this information with me. I hope you found it worthwhile. Your feedback is really important to the Youth Service Bureau. If you have a chance, let us know what you thought of this presentation, the adolescent brain and addiction, and what you think of the topics that we might be covering in future presentations. Let us know if the information was helpful or not, and if there are topics you think we should address that are not on our list already. Feedback can be left on our website, our Facebook page, or you can use the contact information on our website to give us a call or email us. Our upcoming topics, what we're planning on already, are focusing on marijuana today. It's not the weed you and I might have known back in the day, and with legalization, it's going to be something that we really need to consider. We're also going to look at unintended consequences. The new research on internet, social media, and the adverse effects some of these things are having on brain development and our children's social development. Another topic we'll be covering is becoming a better LGBTQIA ally. Part of that is just being able to keep up with what all the letters mean. We will be covering the topic of youth suicide prevention, looking at how at risk our kids are, and some of this ties back into that social media addiction, because we really have seen some increases in suicide rates among middle schoolers in Connecticut and across the nation. And of course, we have to take a look at heroin and opioid abuse because, as we know, it really is an epidemic, and Granby itself has issues related to this. So feedback, please. We really are looking forward to hearing from you and hope that you can let us know what you want to learn more about. So this concludes the presentation. The following slides are there to highlight some of the other programs that the Youth Service Bureau offers. And I hope you take a look and let us know if any of them interest you. Well, thank you very much for spending time with me today going over this. I hope that you found it valuable. One of the things I will say is that the Youth Service Bureau is really interested in your feedback. If you want to take the time and go to our website or our Facebook page and leave us feedback, we will absolutely use that as we plan further programs. You can pick up our contact information on the website. You can email me, call me directly, comment on both the quality or value of this particular presentation, or if you looked at the list of our upcoming presentations, there's something you think we've missed that you would like to have us develop a program for, I would really be interested in hearing from you about that. So again, thank you so much for your time. I hope you find this effective. I hope you're able to access this information, because I really do think it's valuable, and I look forward to bringing you more information as our production continues. Thanks.